Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. And today I am doing a tasting of a whiskey that I bought quite some time ago when I was going across the country and went to Kansas City, went to the World War I Museum. It is one of my favorite museums in the world. I've been to two World War I museums, one in Verdun in France and the other one in Kansas City, and both of them were impressive. Although I will say I was almost teary-eyed coming out of the one in Verdun. It is an emotional place. But Kansas City, home barbecue and home of the Kansas City Royals and the world champion Chiefs, who I wasn't rooting for. We'll get into that later on. Anyway, Rieger is the whiskey, and this is an old brand that goes back to 1887. Like the Nelsons in Tennessee, they, basically was a rediscovery by the family of their distilling heritage. And so, really interesting. I went back and did some searching to find out a little bit more through the newspapers about how they were selling this particular whiskey back then. It was a little tricky to find at first because it wasn't really called Rieger, it was called Monogram. And what was interesting was I was finding advertisements for it that said, "Whiskey for the grip." Okay? And I tried to figure out what the heck they were talking about. I mean, does it help you grasp your bottle better? Now, these are the days, this was around 1899 to 1905. These were the days when there were health claims put on whiskeys. And so one of the whiskeys that was popular, that was selling against this in Kansas City, was Duffy's Pure Malt. And I did a whole episode about Duffy's Pure Malt on Whiskey Lore Stories. It's an interesting story to see how far you actually can go as a snake oil salesman and selling this whiskey as a cure-all, basically saying these people lived to well over 100 years old, and they feel like they're 40, and it's all because they're drinking Duffy's Pure Malt whiskey. So don't know how this solves gripping issues, but anyway, this is an interesting whiskey because it doesn't really follow traditional methods of making whiskey. We could say this is probably more, well, it's not probably more of, it is a blend. And in fact, they call it Kansas City whiskey. So because we're not calling it straight bourbon, rye, something like that, but it's just being called whiskey, then the rules are a bit more lax on what you can do with a whiskey. And so what they've done here is they have taken a straight rye, a straight bourbon, blended those, blended in some light corn whiskey, which means that it was distilled over 160 proof, 160 proof. And then on top of that, they put some Williams and Humboldt 15-year-old sherry in there. So they just poured a little bit in. This is not like Basil Hayden Dark Rye, which I ride on all the time for being heavy-handed with the port wine. In this particular case, they were very light in terms of how much they put in, just enough to give it an accent. And if you read the website, they talk about the fact that this is a lost art and something that was going on before the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. And while that is true, that this could be a pre-prohibition way of making whiskey, there were a lot of other questionable things that were being tossed into whiskey at that time that made it probably a practice more to cover up, deceive, make whatever profits you could versus actually trying to make a really great tasting whiskey. And there was a lot of whiskey that was not what we would consider to be straight whiskey. It was basically the equivalent of light whiskey / vodka that they were just adding flavorings to. I'm not saying that's what Rieger was doing, but that was a practice in that time. Now, if you look at, because this stuff sold all the way across the country, and in fact, it was a mail order whiskey. So back then, unlike today, where it's illegal to ship whiskey around unless you have a license to do so, back then, I'm sure they had all the legal stuff put together, but they were shipping whiskey. You just order some and they ship it out to you. And there were stores I found as far away as California that were selling this whiskey. And the main reason I was looking to see how far out it sold was because I wanted to see what pricing was like, because in Kansas City, its main competition, Nelson's Greenbrier, was popular then. OFC, Old Fire Copper, that is basically out of the Buffalo Trace Distillery. What is the Buffalo Trace Distillery now? And then Duffy's. In Kansas City, Monogram was more expensive, or was cheaper. I mean, it was cheaper, but they didn't have shipping costs. It was coming from in town. And so when you looked at California and you saw it for sale, it was usually a little bit more expensive than some of the other whiskeys that were out there. So my guess is that they were not doing a vodka with flavoring added to it, but that it was probably a bit more refined. So this is 46% ABV. Interesting thing too about this distillery is that Dave Pickerell, who came from Maker's Mark and then helped set up tons of distilleries across the country, craft distilleries, did actually take part in the development of this distillery. And in fact, they have the still room dedicated to him. Now on the nose, this actually has a lot of nice baking spice to it. It has a nutty character. There's a little bit of a, say like a toast and / sawdust kind of a note. Maybe a little bit of brown sugar. I don't really get a lot of sherry influence on this. They really were light in terms of on the nose, although sometimes sherry ends up being a little more nutty than it does. And I've had, was it Oloroso? I believe it was the Oloroso that I tasted not too long ago from Humboldt, Williams and Humboldt, which is out of Jerez, Spain. Cheers. This is a delicious whiskey. It really is impressive to me. It is a bit sweet, but not overly sweet. There's a maple flavor that comes out in this. The sherry comes through on the finish. You really start tasting a bit of that sherry influence. And I actually ended up bringing a second bottle of this back for a friend of mine who is a Scotch drinker. And I told him, I said, I think you would be impressed by this. Yes, it is a corn / rye whiskey, but that sherry influence actually, and nice robust flavor and beautiful mouthfeel, little cinnamon coming through now on the end. Really, really nice whiskey, and one that if you get a chance and you're in Kansas City, it's a little off the beaten path, but beautiful facility and definitely a great tour. So something to check out while you're there, and then go to that World War I museum. If you're interested in that, I'm kind of you can tell, I'm writing a book on Tennessee whiskey. I did a book on Irish whiskey. I've got Kentucky. Yes, that was the first book that I worked on. But I tend to go for the underdog. And so, World War I to me is much more interesting than World War II, because World War II gets talked about all the time. And World War I is confusing and a lot of stuff that we just don't know much about. And so that war fascinates me, and that's part of the reason why I found that museum so interesting. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give me a like if you did, and if you want to subscribe, do so right now, and that way you won't miss any future videos where I'm talking whiskey, talking a little history, digging into the stuff that nobody really talks about, and I kind of find fascinating on my own. And until next time, cheers and Slainte. Yeah, there's like a raisiny note that comes through definitely on the palate, but it mixes with that corn flavor and then that maple syrup flavor. So it's very interesting.